Hi, my name is Alan McGraw, and this is my journal for Module 4 about the veterans of World War II. So the first question for this journal entry is, what are the main themes of this module's material? So the main themes I got from this module's material are firstly the GI Bill and the massive impact that had on the veterans of World War II, and actually even the veterans since, and just how far-reaching those benefits were. They were unprecedented. It was unlike anything that had ever been done for veterans of previous wars, and also unique in that it was actually enacted and put in place before the end of the war. The other main theme I got from this section was regarding the concerns and fears that surrounded the sudden re-entry into American society of the 16 million veterans who had served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II, which obviously 16 million is a large amount of people, and the sudden influx back into American society worried people. They were worried that there wouldn't be enough jobs. Trying to get 16 million people back to work, you would think you would have a shortage of available positions. Luckily, much of that was not seen because there was not a recession following World War II, quite like there had been following previous wars such as World War One. But anyway, there was a great deal of concern surrounding this period, and some labor strife, some fighting, political fighting between unions trying to get the veterans on their side, but unions also being viewed in a bad light due to some of the strikes they had participated in even during the war. So there were battles like that, political battles, which had become commonplace. The politicization of Veterans Affairs continued through this period. So the second and third questions I'm going to answer together since they're kind of combined, or one is a follow-up to the other. So the continuities I saw in this unit's material, the continuities with prior material we've gone through, is just the respect and honor that was shown to veterans returning, and it wasn't always deeper than surface level, but it seems to me that for the most part people were truly grateful for what these men and women had sacrificed. And another continuity I saw was the widespread public support for expanding veterans benefits and the widespread public support that the GI Bill received. Another continuity was the knowledge of psychological issues that soldiers dealt with was more fully continued its trend of being understood better with each successive war. Was typically known as combat fatigue during World War II. It seemed to have changed names through each different era. In fact, it's now what we call PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. It didn't. There's a misconception that veterans of World War II didn't have the same issues that maybe Vietnam veterans and modern day veterans have with their mental issues, but I think more than anything that was just from a reluctance of men from that generation to talk about their war experiences, and so they tended to bury some of those stresses. But there are plenty of stories of men waking up, having nightmares and waking up thinking they're in combat again and things like that. So they had the issues just as much as any other generation. It just tended to get glossed over with this generation. So some of the changes I saw were, in terms of combat-related changes, the survivability of wounds increased greatly, which was a good thing, but also tended to tax the American government more in terms of trying to help rehabilitate wounded soldiers. There were just far more wounded soldiers from this war, and helping them get back on their feet, literally and figuratively, became a bigger task. Part of the reason for the survivability of wounds increasing was the development of things like penicillin and blood plasma, and the ability to rapidly evacuate people who had been wounded. Michael Gambone, in his book The Greatest Generation Comes Home, veteran in American society, he goes into some detail, as does Bernard Rosker in his book Providing for the Casualties of War, about the huge increase in survivability for combat wounds, and all the reasons for those, and that's where I got that information. Another change that we saw was that just the GI Bill, the expanding of veterans benefits. So the GI Bill really came about through FDR pushing for it, the President FDR pushing for it, and in hopes of trying to preempt the successive fights that had gone on following each war, and how were they going to handle veterans affairs, and how were they going to deal with compensating veterans and that type of deal. And so in order to get out in front of that is why he proposed the GI Bill, which technically was known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, but everybody knows of it as the GI Bill. And there were some really great things that I'll go into great things that the GI Bill had that I will go into in a later question. Another interesting change was that during this period, the first peacetime draft began. It began in late 1940, actually shortly, not just a few months before the Pearl Harbor, about a year before Pearl Harbor was attacked. But there had never been a draft during peacetime. In fact, if I remember right, there had only been drafts. There was a pretty limited draft in the Civil War, and at least limited on the Union side. I think it was more widespread amongst the Confederate side. And then there had been a draft for World War I, but it had not happened until America joined the conflict. And again, why this came about was, again, FDR trying to preempt an issue that he could see coming. It was becoming obvious. The war had actually started in Asia in the early 1930s with Japan attacking into China and Manchuria, those areas, and had started in Europe in 1939, September of 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland. So it had been several years of fighting, and it was becoming more and more obvious that at some point the U.S. would get dragged into it. And so in order to try and be more prepared for conflict this time, FDR had issued the first peacetime draft, instated the first peacetime draft. So the next question was, what was the most surprising thing you learned in this module? So for me, it was the part in Gambone's book, the part where he was discussing the veterans who went to college. So my grandfather actually used the GI Bill to go to school. Also, he was actually a Korean War veteran, not a World War II veteran. But I was aware that college was not all that popular at that day and time compared to what it is these days. So I was actually surprised to hear how many veterans used the GI Bill to go to college. I knew that many had used it for vocational training and things of that nature, but I was surprised at how many went to college. In fact, in Gambone's book, he goes into some of the numbers. Like in the fall of 1946, there were 2 million total applicants, new applicants to colleges across the U.S. Of those, 2,970,000 of those were veterans, so nearly half. And then again in 1947, there were 1.1 million veterans enrolled, which was 49% of all college students in the country. That was pretty incredible. Those were pretty incredible numbers, in my opinion, and I was just surprised by those. It was still significantly less. He does state later on in the book that 3.5 million veterans used the educational benefits given under the GI Bill to either finish their secondary education or go to vocational schools or things like that to learn a trade, rather than to go to colleges to learn things like engineering. They just did trade schools. So it was still, the majority still did not go to college, but I was surprised that as many did as they did. Part number 5 is asking for the thesis statement on this module's material, and here is mine. The passing of the GI Bill in 1944 ensured that veterans returning home from World War II would have a smoother transition back into civilian life than did their predecessors. There were certainly many flaws in how the new benefits were administered to veterans, and there was also much fighting that went on in the country in terms of things like labor strikes and things of that nature. So it wasn't flawless, but the new benefits, especially those regarding education and loans, really helped returning soldiers reintegrate into civilian life more quickly and more fully than had prior generations. The next question is asking to discuss how this module's material connects with material of the previous modules. One of the things I saw is that this module continues the trend of the gradually increasing benefits for veterans, and actually kind of caps off that trend with the signing of the GI Bill, which is what we still use today. It has been modified some, but that general legislation is what we still use to compensate veterans for their service. I also noticed the continued trend of the great respect for American veterans and the sincere pride that Americans have for their military service members and those who have served, and also the continued widespread support for veterans benefits, even amongst both Democrats and Republicans, conservatives typically being more reluctant to have the government fund things of that nature, welfare programs, yet every conservative I know is very, very much for soldier benefits for ex-soldiers. So that's another trend that has continued throughout the course of this material. The last question is for those focusing on a historiography, which is me, to discuss and prove a major assertion of the narrative discussed in this module via one of the primary sources. So the biggest narrative I saw throughout the material in this module was that regarding the GI Bill, and just how significant and how important that was in the revolution of benefits for veterans. So the GI Bill, as Michael Gambone states, it was really made up of 3 primary benefits, those being an educational benefit, which meant either college, or they would pay for either college or vocational training or things of that nature to train get soldiers some training for that they could use to further their careers once they got out. The next major benefit was unemployment compensation for veterans. If they couldn't find work, they received a stipend from the government. And lastly, the last of the three major benefits they got under the GI Bill were loans for homes and farms and businesses, which are still active today. In fact, I just sold my first home last year, and United States Marine, ex-Marine, bought my house using a VA loan, and I now live in a different house on the other side of town. So those are still highly used today. The school part, as Gambone describes, the school part was the educational portion of the benefit was meant to not only help the soldiers earn knowledge for a future career, but it was also to help re-socialize them and reintegrate them into American society. And it was felt that through going to these secondary education schools that they would have a more easy transition back into normal American society and American life. And it does seem to have gone more smoothly. There were certainly, it certainly wasn't perfect, but the greatest generation does seem to have had about as smooth a transition as you could have, especially considering the circumstances of that war and just how many men and women were involved, and how much had changed. Many of these guys and gals were overseas for years at a time, and so you can imagine how different things must have been when they finally got home and had not seen family, friends, or their hometowns for that many years, and how much would have changed over that period. So the greatest generation, as they're colloquially known, really transitioned quite well, and many of them became the future leaders of our country. As Dr. Stevens said in her lecture, mentioned people like George H.W. Bush and Bob Dole, guys who were veterans of World War II that ended up becoming leaders of our nation. Dwight Eisenhower, obviously, another one. Anyway, that's all I have for this journal. Thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you soon.